Good evening, and welcome back for Episode 3 of Series 1, The Search for the Slavic Vampire of History. As we all know, Slavic scholars and vampirologists have had a real problem finding vampires. No, not the wannabe fake fang variety, but instead the real ones. And that's to be expected when you keep digging in the wrong place, looking for debunked traits. If only they had looked more closely at all hidden in plain sight prior to the 17th century, prior to the appearance of those ridiculous blood-drinking revenant traits, they might have discovered what you are about to. As promised, tonight we're punching through the 17th century barrier vampirologists avoid like the plague for not having a clue how to explain what they find there. And where we're going to discover that our crucifix-wearing Christian priest, Father Vampire, wasn't some strange fluke, his name but a one-time historical anomaly. To the contrary, in fact, he was but one of many actual vampires found named there. And not just as individuals, but as families, communities, and even entire towns. Tonight's episode: Vampires everywhere. In our last episode, we carefully examined the primary traits ascribed to the Slavic vampire and that we later attached to myths and legends worldwide, and scientifically and logically debunked them all. What can't be debunked is the historical Father Vampire himself and his name, Upir. The name and term that means the same as our modern word vampire, the very being we seek. A term so ancient that it dates back not just to the invention of the false blood-drinking beliefs 300 years ago, not even to Father Vampire's time 1,000 years ago, but instead goes all the way back to at least the 4th century, 1600 years ago. So as all our ridiculous traits for the vampire are debunked, then our only hope of uncovering the truth about him must lie with his name. The name created by the Slavs, literally defining him and defying that being. So was it just a name, or did that name actually mean something specific? After all, it's the only reliable clue we have left, the only piece of evidence unchanged throughout all of Slavic and Proto-Slavic history. So, did that name, that term, mean something specific when first used? And if so, then what? Of course, according to most vampirologists, this term has yet to be appropriately explained thus far. According to them, at least, their etymology is still unclear. Well, as it happens,
that's not entirely accurate.
No, it most certainly isn't. There is at least one doctorate-level vampirologist I know who cracked this term's meaning. And in a later episode, that meaning and its full import will be revealed. For this episode, however, we're first breaching that 17th century barrier, as promised, to reveal how that name was used and where that knowledge leads us. You see, as it happens, while we know our term vampire is derived from progressively older forms originating with the old Russian opiate, yet Father Vampire wasn't the first to have this name, not by a long shot. After all, we know the term vampire has been around since before the rise of Christianity. That's because prior to 1600 CE, believe it or not, Upir The later form of Upir was a common boy's name. You see, in addition to Father Vampire, and despite how scant are Slavic records dating this far back, yet Dr. Burkowski was still able to find other Slavs bearing this same name, such as another Novgorodian 400 years later, a peasant named Makarenko Upir, though I did find another Russian online source that alternately gives his name as Makariye Upir, calling him a famous villager. Well, as it happens, whether called Makarenko or Makariye makes no difference because the term originates with the same meaning, supremely blessed. Hardly the name ascribed to an evil person or a sinful person. And yes, I know, given that Upir appears second, it might seem that this was this peasant's last name. However, as many sources point out, Russian peasants didn't have last names until beginning late in the 19th century, which was still centuries after this peasant's time. Thus, presumably, what we have here is yet another instance of an adjective or descriptor being given the actual first name. Kind of like Robin Hood calling his friend Little John, or the famous Jimmy Dean song from the 60s, Big Bad John. In both cases, there's no doubt that the first name is still John, and in this case as well. Here, the name literally means supremely blessed vampire. Again, not something designating an evil person. Now, it's also possible this adjective was added to perhaps help differentiate him from others with the same Upir name. The next historical vampire name that we find occurs less than 100 years later, where we find Upirev Tarasko Kuzmin, who was also called a famous villager and lived over 100 miles northeast of Novgorod. And then last of all, we find Klim Upir, another peasant living in western Russia who lived precisely right on that 17th century barrier, his name appearing right at 1600 CE. Only about 50 years before the name began to be falsely demonized, and all possessing it labeled demonic revenants after death. Notice also here that Dr. Burkowski states he found additional similar names, though unfortunately he fails to give them to us. Nevertheless, all of this proves that Upir was a fairly common personal male name, with many such appearing in history over several centuries, all of them therefore documented cases of real historical Upiri, vampires, and all of them mortal, even respectable men, with nothing the least questionable, much less evil or demonic, mentioned about any of them. That is, not until right at about 1600 CE, becoming increasingly more demonized up through the 1700s. Obviously, therefore, something major happened during this time in Slavic lands that caused this former common male name to become so horribly demonized. So much so that from that time forward, we don't find anyone naming their sons Upir. But until that time, Upir was such a common personal name and so much in historical evidence that even our redoubtable Professor Oinus had to begrudgingly admit that since Upir was a personal name in Russia since the earliest of times, the vampire could not be as bloodthirsty or detestable as he thought. Well, that was mighty generous of him, don't you think? However, this term wasn't only used as a boy's name, but also used, and on both sides of the 17th century barrier, to identify children claimed sired by vampires. Even in Serbia, where the vampire was first falsely demonized, vampire children were called by very special names, so designating them as actually sired by vampire fathers with Slavic women. In other Slavic regions, a vampire child, if a boy, was called a vampir or dampir, and if a girl, a dampirica or vampirica. Further south in Bulgaria, we find other names given these vampire children and vampire descendants, that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. Yet, as unbelievable as that might seem, Dr. Perkowski goes on to claim something even more amazing: the existence of an actual last name, Dampiraj, in Albania, meaning vampire children. Now see, if this is true, then that means vampire children at some point chose to actually and proudly adopt as their last name from that time forward for themselves and all future generations, declaring themselves to have been literally descended from vampires. Now think about that. Would anyone have done this if the vampire were other than honorable? Of course, it's one thing to claim such a last name exists, another to verify it. And so I did. And here it is, Dampiraj, assuming that's how it's pronounced, an Albanian last name to this day. But what really shocked me was also finding an even more explicitly vampiric Albanian last name, Dampiri, the literal plural of Dampir, and therefore meaning vampire children. And having found both of these as actual last names, I kept going. And while I couldn't find any of the other designations for vampire children as last names, which was a long shot at best, yet I was surprised to find an apparent cognate of Svetocher, meaning vampire descendants or children, in the Russian last name, existing still today, Svetoch. So having found this Russian last name, I kept looking and was blown away when I found the fairly common Russian last names Upirov and Upirova, the original Russian term for vampire, Upir, right there for all of us to see, and literally meaning sired by or otherwise belonging to the vampire. So there it is. Vampire last names. So now that we've found men literally named vampire from birth, as well as extensive Slavic terms for vampire descendants, and even last names still in existence today for both men and women allegedly sired by vampires for countless generations thereafter, let's move on to the truly shocking evidences found in pre-17th century history. The evidences for entire towns filled with real historical vampires. Now, it was Dr. Perkowski who first mentions Russian places, towns, Upiri and Upiro, and others, as he states here. And yes, Upiri literally means vampires. However, while I couldn't find either of these two places or towns online, yet I did find many other Russian towns whose names literally mean vampire town, or Vampireville, or Vampiropolis, because all of them begin with Upir, and their endings have that kind of meaning. For example, the town of Upiralovo, Upirkovo, Upirvici, and what here appears to be the ruins of a small village called Upirevo. I then expanded my search outside Russia and found another vampire town, Upirovo, located in Belarus, a neighboring country to the west. Dr. Perkowski next gives us 4 more vampire towns, this time located further west in Poland. The first 2 of these towns are identically named Vampirsk, again meaning vampire town. And yes, I pronounced it Vampirsk, which I just learned only last week is this word's correct pronunciation. He then mentions a meadow named Vampirs. And all of these places I was able to find online, including multiple references to the larger of these towns, having been in existence since at least 1411. Again, well before the 1600 barrier and its demonization of vampires. Okay, now, about the pronunciation of this term. As you'll recall in our first episode, I pronounced this Polish term, the Polish term for vampire, as being vampires. However, last week I looked more closely at how this word was spelled in actual Polish and realized the second letter of the word is not our letter A, but instead is a Polish variant having a kind of a tail added to it, which thanks to another YouTube channel, Learn Polish with Monika, she pronounces correctly as ong, which, as she explains here, when followed, as in this case, by a P, makes the sound of an M. Thus, this Polish word for vampire is correctly pronounced vampires. So when it's put together, vampires. And now you hear the M sound. So this is most likely how the M sound got added to the term in South Slavic lands, changing the earlier Bulgarian term vapir into the Serbian vampir. And if this is correct, then we've just filled in a small piece of the vampire puzzle right here. This historical puzzle piece dropping perfectly into place. Thanks, Monika. Okay, so do these Polish towns really exist too? They sure do. Here's Vampirsk itself, and here's its smaller twin. And I even found that meadow, though now it appears to be a forested area, which makes me wonder whether, like with Upir, there might be ruins of an actual vampire town still unexcavated, just waiting to be rediscovered. Times like these, I wish I were Indiana Jones. Oh, and of course, I just had to do a search on this to see if it might also be a possible last name. And sure enough, here it is, Vampirski, effectively meaning, yet again, in a different language now, sired by or of the vampire. Now, in addition to these two Vampirsk towns, Dr. Perkowski lists two more towns in Poland related to the vampire called Strigi, or Strigi, in existence since at least 1362, again, well before the 1600 barrier. And sure enough, I found both of these towns still in existence today. Now, why would Dr. Perkowski include these as vampire towns? After all, Striga, and that's the root word in Polish, sounds nothing like Upir. Well, as you'll recall from our first episode, while our word vampire comes from South Slavic vampir, and their term from the original Slavic Upir, and before all of these, the old Russian term opir, yet beginning in and again about the 17th century, a new word arose, strigon, appearing first in Croatia in documents related to the supposed vampire case of Jure Grando in 1656, the source of all the demonization. And from there, that term we find moving north into Romania as their word strigoi, still used today for vampire, and then further north still into Poland as their word strigon. So how did this word arrive in Croatia, and what does it mean? Well, as should be obvious, the word is not Slavic. Instead, it's Italian. Specifically, it came from the Venetian word striga. And how do we know Venice is its place of origin? Well, as we can see very clearly right here in this map, here we see Croatia, the home country of Jure Grando, and there's Venice located right across the bay from it. And as you'll notice here, Venice is located only about 100 miles by land from Jure Grando's hometown, Kringa, and only about half that distance by water. And what does this Venetian term actually mean? Well, as we learn here, it doesn't mean vampire, which term doesn't exist in Western Europe, but instead is derived from the Venetian word striga, meaning witch. Thus, Jure Grando was called a witch, though later this was considered strangely synonymous with vampire. And sure enough, we also find the Polish term strigon, means the exact same thing as we verify in this Wikipedia article, where again we find this term meaning both witch and vampire until about the 18th century, which coincides perfectly with the time of the Serbian vampire panics. Thus it would appear the term witch, already demonized in Western Europe for centuries, somehow got ported over into Slavic lands for reasons no one has been able to figure out, and demonized there as well. And then quickly became synonymous with Upiri, vampires. But why? In Slavic lands, as we've already seen, vampires were normal, real-life mortal men, just as witches were mostly women. So how could witches ever get confused with vampires? This has remained one of the most mystifying historical puzzles to this day. That is, until this series. For as we shall fully explore in a future episode, there is indeed an astounding trait held in common between witches and vampires that fully explains the demonization both suffered. A common trait hiding in plain sight all this time, yet completely missed by Western scholars. And yes, before you ask, I also did a search on this Polish variant for witch, Striga, as a last name. And guess what? I found it as well. This last name identifying each family member bearing such as being either a witch or a vampire, depending on the time frame when this last name was first used. Okay, so we found vampire towns from Russia to Poland. But what about in South Slavic lands, the source of all the false demonization for vampires as first revenants and then blood drinkers? Have vampire towns and descendants been found there as well? Well, as you've probably guessed, of course they have. Shockingly, even here, where everything false about the vampire was born, we still find the same common trait for the vampire siring children that were called by special names, so identifying them. And here too as well we find Dr. Perkowski mentioning yet another entire village filled with their direct descendants. And while I would love to show you this town also, yet sadly Dr. Perkowski failed to name it. But regardless, there we have it. A summary of historically documented pre-17th century evidences for the literal existence of real men named and called vampires. Of villages and towns named for their vampire populations. Of generations of children sired by vampires continuing right up to today, with modern last names still proudly identifying them as such. All of this strongly evidencing for a literal vampire bloodline hidden in plain sight all of this time. And all while we, here in the West, ridiculously continue arguing and debating about fictional vampire traits scientifically debunked 300 years ago. Obviously, none of these real vampires of history lived as undead beings, much less blood drinkers, nor do they today. Instead, they live today as they have for millennia, as honorable, mortal, workaday people, and their descendants after them as families, communities, and towns throughout untold generations. Yet also, while apparently founded on, if not still possessing, some as yet unidentified special uniqueness, some missing key trait, considered so unique that it got them brutally demonized by their non-vampire Slavic neighbors, first as revenants and later as blood-drinking ones, and slaughtered for it. Now, while you've probably never heard of the murders of living vampires as revenants, yet there are evidences for this. Vampire hunters were well known in Slavic lands throughout these times, just as also were witch hunters, witch examiners. And while we have scant records for the happenings in Slavic lands during the 17th and 18th centuries, due to the low level of literacy at that time, yet there are accounts of living townsmen being murdered as vampires. Serbian scholar Professor Tatomir Bukanovic, who we learned about in episode 2, recounts one such case of a shopkeeper who, having been accused of being a vampire, fled the area for another town, where he opened a shop. And as the story continues, later he was found by a former neighbor who asked him, "What are you doing here?" and then added, "Are you such and such a man?" "Yes," replied the vampire, "but please don't tell anyone that you saw me." When the neighbor returned, he told the vampire's brother about him. The man did not believe it, but went to see for himself and was convinced. The vampire was brought back together with all his property, money, and goods, and killed. Now, obviously, if he was a shopkeeper with property, money, and goods, then he could have only been a mortal, well-established, well-reputed merchant, not a blood-drinking, reanimated corpse. Yet, nevertheless, he was murdered as a real vampire. Also hinted at here is the possibility that while one family member might possess this key vampire trait, whatever it is, yet his own brother, also presumably descended from the same vampiric line, did not. So that might mean that this trait either skips a generation or perhaps even skips members within that same generation. So what is that key trait? Well, while not enough evidences have yet been presented to definitively state what that trait is, we do have enough evidences to narrow down the field of possibilities pretty substantially. To begin with, given that vampires are found throughout all Slavic lands, then logically, that key trait, so identifying them in all such lands, must be a common trait to them all. In other words, we're not going to find that trait being some regional belief found in only one or two areas. And as beliefs in vampires have existed since at least the 4th century CE, then that key trait, whatever it is, must also be found evidence throughout Slavic history and on both sides of the 17th century barrier, and probably right up to today, just as we've found for the existence of the Slavic vampire and his descendants. So right there, this additionally and decisively rules out both blood drinking and also being a revenant. For as we discovered in episode 2, blood drinking wasn't found as a vampire trait until after 1600 CE. Nor do we find this belief native to Eastern Slavic lands, most notably Russia, where we find the earliest mentions of the vampire. And this also rules out the trait of being a revenant. For while this belief is found throughout all Slavic lands, yet it does not predate 1600 CE for vampires. Remember in episode 2 we talked about when Christianity arrived and forced burial on the pagan Slavs, that's when the belief in revenants began. But that belief wasn't associated with vampires until after Jure Grando in 1656. Before that, they were just revenants. As for all the other vampire beliefs, they're either regional ones, varying from place to place, or else find their origins in our own Western fictions. So, with all of these traits ruled out, what could possibly be left? In fact, there is only one trait left, or rather, the hint of but one singular trait qualifying on all counts, both being found universally mentioned throughout all Slavic lands and also found throughout all periods of Slavic history. And believe it or not, it is also the only vampire aspect that's been the most evidenced of them all, staring us in the face all this time, yet that has remained hidden in plain sight to this day. In fact, it's so well hidden that even now, you probably still haven't seen it, even though I've done nothing but present the evidences to you for it throughout this entire episode. Perhaps if I were to provide a few examples from our own Western fictions and films, it'd be clearer. That's right. This same key trait is so inherent to the vampire, so identified with him, that we find its aspect infused deeply throughout almost all our Western fictional portrayals as well. and all we have to do to see it is to simply look past the fictional blood-drinking, horror, and death motifs. Only then does the real vampire of history begin to coalesce almost spectrally into view, emerging hazily before us from the swirling mists of time from whence he originated. Since the vampire's first artistic depiction in 1820, through our earliest penny dreadfuls to our greatest literary classics and on up to today's novels, we find permeating and flowing throughout them all a single overriding current, still palpably felt radiating just beneath the surface. And our silver screen portrayals have only more explicitly presented that underground historical current with the classic vampire tableau always the same. The dark, handsome, ethereal stranger emerging from the moonlit shadows, deftly fending off attacks from townsmen threatened by him, ultimately approaching each nubile ingenue in her boudoir, receiving her consent before entering, to find the enraptured young woman awaiting his arrival. As he approaches, she reclines breathlessly back, opening her nightgown for him as he then overshadows her. Have you caught a glimpse of him now? You might think you have, but whatever you think you see pales in comparison to what the real vampiric trait actually is, as we shall delve into far more deeply in later episodes. For with the vampire, relationships and their limitless communions are taken to heights and depths simply incomprehensible to most of us, and unimaginable to all save for those very few with whom such have been shared. As we should have recognized all along, this is what we find throughout actual vampire history. The very history summarized so briefly here tonight. After all, you don't get so much new life, so many children and generations of descendants across several countries from anything other than love, devotion, nurturing, the polar opposite of evil, blood-drinking, terror, and death. Nor do you gain a near universal reputation for being so supernaturally unique simply for having a way with the ladies. And never could mere pedestrian love affairs result in such horrifying demonization thereafter. Obviously, something far greater than mere libido has been in play here for millennia. Something so extraordinarily special as to fully explain both the vampire's storied irresistible allure with women and the transformative vampiric awakening claimed experienced with him, through him, as a result of him, throughout all of Slavic history. Beginning with our next episode, I shall begin to present to you, all strictly by the academic sources as always, the very specific, sometimes a bit explicit, historical evidences for the real Slavic vampires' deeply insatiable romantic nature, deemed too dangerous, first by Christianity and later by Victorian age censors, to ever be made public. This will be an episode you won't want to miss. Until then, thank you for joining us on our continuing search for the Slavic vampire of history. Our next episode, the romantically insatiable vampire. Thank you and good night.